So if you've been around here online at all, you hear me say often, you hear Jeremy say it often, Chris, we love spending time with you here online. And when we put this together for online consumption, for wherever you're at, whatever type of device you're on, what we do is we take a lot of the important parts of our in-person service and we kind of mash them all together and we put this service together so that we can make the most of your time and that we can keep everyone's attention, because we understand that time is precious and we understand that our time with you is limited. So we have to limit what we do with our time here in our online community. Now, we're in this series, Breathing Room, and how amazing would it be if we lived a life where we realized that our time is precious, that we didn't just fill our life up with meaningless things to just keep going from one thing to the next and just cram it all in, but we took a step back and realized that our time is precious and we really focused on the things that were important in our lives so that we could get the most out of our lives here on this earth. Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today. So why don't we jump on over for part 3 of our series, Breathing Room with Jeremy.
If you're like me and you're more than 40, let's go with ish, years old, you might remember Cyndi Lauper singing a song called Time After Time. You maybe even are hearing that kind of hook in your head right now because it's a famous song. It's been re-recorded dozens and dozens of times. In fact, McDonald's used it last year in an advertising campaign. But the song, when she and the co-writer wrote it, was about a woman who was leaving her boyfriend at the time, or her husband or lover at the time. And as she was leaving, she became very homesick and wanted to go home and see her mom. That iconic video of her seeing her mom and saying, time after time, you'll be here for me when you fall. Here's the thing is that, for us, a lot of us, that Mother's Day is a joyous occasion. We get to celebrate the moms that are a part of our life. We get to celebrate the people who made us fathers, who are the moms of our children. We get a chance to celebrate some great people. But maybe today for you, that idea of Mother's Day is really a little bit painful. In fact, maybe that's the reason you're at home right now. Maybe it's because today is a little bit of a difficult day for you. Maybe in the last couple of years, maybe even because of COVID, you lost your mom. And that has been really difficult. Today's been a day you're not looking forward to. Or maybe the idea of motherhood is something that has been really hard for you. Maybe it's something that you've gone, man, we've tried, we've invested, we've risked everything to be parents, and it just hasn't worked out like you'd wanted. Or maybe you became a mom unexpectedly and you had to give your child up for adoption. And that was tough on you. Some very, very painful things have gone on in your life around the idea of motherhood. But regardless of what today's about for moms or how you feel or what you're going through, I do want you to get something about that song. When Cyndi Lauper wrote that time after time, talking about, kind of being homesick for mom and that she would be there for her time after time, the same thing that's true in some of your pain might be real in that statement today. It's time after time after time until there's no more time. Time is one of those things that we feel like it's unlimited. We can write time after time after time, like you're so consistent, so dependable, so always going to be there. But then there's a limit to the amount of time that we have. That's one of those things that is so important for us to kind of wrap our mind around and really even dive into today as we talk about breathing room in our time. It's okay, remember, for our closet or our trunk or our back seat to look like this. It's okay for those things to be crammed in, and some of you are going, no, it's not okay at all, right? But it's not okay if our time, if our relationships, if our money looks like this. We need some breathing room. We need to have our life look a little bit like this. Now, some of you see this closet and you look at that person and go, man, that person just needs to go shopping. That's what that person needs to do. And I understand the feeling. But what happens is our life needs some breathing room financially, like we talked about last week, that your money is limited, but because of debt, right, you don't have to limit what you do with your money, but time is limited. And we need some breathing room. We've been using this phrase to understand what is breathing room. Breathing room is the space between our current pace and the limits. We all have limits. You have limits. I have limits. We may not want to admit we have limits, but we have physical limitations. There is only so much time that we can have. That's a limit. And the reality is, unlike our money, where our money is limited, but we can always borrow more money, you cannot borrow time. You can't call a friend and go, hey, you know what, can I borrow an extra 15 minutes from you today since you're not using it? Or man, you've saved up some time and put it in a box or you can't do that, right? You can't put money away in an account to use later. You can't save it or you can't buy it or borrow it. All you can do is spend it. And that's an important thing for us to get and realize and understand today. Now, what's great about it for all of us is that the Bible, when we open up this book that maybe you're terrified by, or maybe you even have questions about whether you believe it's true or not, and I want you to know something if you're here today, and faith, Jesus, God, the church, all that stuff is arm's length. Maybe you've got tons of questions and you're pushing back and you're not sure about any of it. I want you to know something, that when we open up this Bible today, that I think you can learn something from it. I think you can interact with it, even if you don't believe that it's true. Because I think it's not just a God thing when we talk about time. And it's not just a church thing. And it's not just a faith thing. I think when we talk about time, it's a thing, right? It's a part of your life and mine. We all have a 24-hour day to live. And I think there are some things that we can go, hey, listen, I can understand and interact with some of this stuff, even if I don't necessarily believe it's all true. So there's this guy in Scripture, maybe you've heard of him. His name is Moses. And Moses has a unique understanding or a unique perspective when it comes to time. You see, historically speaking, Moses was 120 years old when he died. Now, you may call, be not sure about that one, right? You may be pushing back and going, I don't believe that he was 120 years old. It makes sense to me that when people had less going on, they lived longer, when they had less natural kind of causes of things, less problems in life, that life lasted longer. And that's the case with Moses. Moses and lots of people around his time period lived 120 years. And the Bible makes a special point of saying that Moses could see well when he was 120. Now, I don't know about you, but when I turned about 40, I started needing some longer arms, if you know what I'm saying. Things needed to get a little further away, or I needed a little more light to be able to read stuff, because my eyes didn't start working too well. But the Bible makes a point of saying that not only was Moses 120, but he could still see well at 120. Now, he had a unique perspective on life because Moses had several different kind of really big spans of his life that basically were careers. In fact, if you figure that you'll spend about 40 years in your career or 40 years doing what you do, the truth is that Moses had 3 of those kind of phases of life. The first one, he was born as a Hebrew into an Egyptian home, into the Pharaoh's home, to the king of the Egyptians, right? And so he was given into this family, and he grew up in Pharaoh's home as an Egyptian, even though he was a Hebrew. And that is a big deal. He grew up the first 40 years of his life, learned that he was Hebrew, and then saw an injustice happening to a Hebrew slave at the time. and he lost his stuff, right? And he went in and threw it and like made it right and killed the Egyptian that was there. So he ended that phase of his life and was banned from Egypt, and he became a shepherd. He spent 40 years in the desert as a shepherd with nothing but breathing room. Like his job was to take the sheep out during the day, hang out with them and do nothing all day, take them back at night and go to sleep. He had nothing but breathing room. He had all kinds of space. So remember, the lap of luxury into this nomadic shepherd. And then the last 40 years of his life was interesting because God called him to go into Egypt, back to where he was born, and go into the house of Pharaoh and demand that Pharaoh let God's people, let the Hebrew people go from slavery. And he did exactly that. And Pharaoh kept saying no. Maybe you're familiar with the story or maybe the movie, the 10 Commandments. He would say, let my people go. And Pharaoh would say no. And a new plague would come in. And he was God's mouthpiece. And then once Pharaoh finally gave in, Moses spent the last 40 years of his life leading God's people, more than 1 million of them. So we've got these 3 different phases of life. 40 years growing up in and around the palace of Pharaoh, 40 years as a shepherd, and then 40 years as a leader of a nation. So I'd say, without really a whole lot of discussion, that Moses has a unique perspective on time, right? You could agree with that, even if you don't agree with or understand or believe in the things of the Bible. So when Moses writes this particular thing we're going to look at, it's one of the Psalms. Now, when you normally hear the Psalms, you normally think of David, you normally think of songs, and that's true of this, but this one wasn't written by David, it was written by Moses. And here is what he says. He says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Through all the phases of my life and the lives of our people, you have been our dwelling place. And look what he says in the next verse. He says, before the mountains were born, you brought forth the whole world. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Now, Moses' perspective is one that's unique. He had 3 totally different phases like us, but he had this massively long life. We'd say 120 years is a long time. I was just watching on the news this week, and this lady that turned 100 years old went skydiving, tandem diving for the very first time. She jumped out of a plane at 100 years old, and I was like, wow, that's an unbelievable story. Moses was 120, and he had lived this full and complete life, way longer than, to be honest with you, I want to live. And he says this, he recognizes that God, before the mountains were born, or you were brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. What Moses recognized and what's important to you and me is that we understand that no matter how long our life is, it's literally just a breath. God's life, what he recognized in that and what we need to recognize is that God's existence is from everlasting to everlasting. He is above it all. His life isn't limited by time. That his life, from Moses' perspective, was just this like tiny little life versus God's entire life. In fact, that's what he goes on to say a couple of verses later. He says, 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. A watch is about 3 hours, like you're on watch. Or you might hear somebody say, not on my watch, right? That's the not on my kind of shift. And that's exactly what Moses was saying. Your life, who you are, your existence is everlasting to everlasting, and you are God. 1,000 years is like a blip. It's like a breath to you. 1,000 years goes by, and what I would think is just a few hours. What is my life in the big picture of things? And that's kind of the important thing that you and I need to take away right now. That you and I need to process or think about our time in comparison to God's time. And here's really what it boils down to for us, that 1,000 years is like a day, like in your sight, or like a day that's just gone by. That's important for us to get, because here's what's important. Our days come to 70 years or 80. if our strength endures. Yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, and they quickly pass, and we fly away. You see what he's saying is, listen, our lives might mount up to 70 years or 80 years, or in Moses' kind of case, 120 years. But our lives might amount to a handful of years, but they come and go and they quickly pass. You know what? That is important for us to understand. Even if you don't believe the whole expanse of God and who he is and his grandness like I do. But here's the thing, that you can agree, just like I agree, that we're going to last 70, 80, 85, 90, 91, say 100 years, like that lady who jumps out of a plane. My great-grandma passed away, and she was almost 102 years old. So what Moses is saying is, we're going to last 70 or 80 years if our strength endures. But yeah, the best of them are going to be trouble and sorrow. But here's the deal. Time after time after time after time, until there's no more time, they quickly pass. That's what I need us to get today, is that your time is limited. And if we can only understand that important piece of it, that you can understand this next verse. He says about God, he says, if we only knew the power of your anger, your wrath is as great as the fear that is your due. So here's what he's doing. He's recognizing the significance of who God is. He's recognizing the brevity of who we are. And now he's recognizing the character of who God is. Now, we don't like this word wrath or anger, and we don't really understand it a ton. And I'll be honest with you, I'm just going to kind of summarize it for us. What he's basically saying is something along these lines. If we could see God as he is, then we would give him the reverence he's due. If we could see the expanse and the character and the specificity of the grandness of who God is, then we would give him the awe or the reverence, the fear that he's due. That's an important word. So here's what I would say is kind of an easier way to say it. If we could see God as he is, we would be more careful with the time that we've been given, that we've been allotted. That if we could see the expanse of the grandness of God, and we could see the brevity of the time we have here, then we would be a little bit more careful what we crammed into our time. We'd be a little bit more careful, and so we'd give ourselves some breathing room in our life. Because breathing room is what makes this life able to be enjoyed fully. And that's really what's important for us to understand. So Moses says this next. He says, Lord, teach us to number our days. Teach us to number our days that we might gain a heart of wisdom. Teach us to number our days. Now, here's the thing we all believe about God. At some point or another, if you believe that there is a God, then you believe that that God has something to do with the number of days that you'll be on this earth. Either he knows them, maybe, I don't really know. Or he determines them, maybe, I don't really know. Or he understands them in some way that I don't know. And so what he's saying is, God, I'm going to recognize that you last from everlasting to everlasting. God, that you were here before the mountains were born. And because you have all of that and I only have this, would you teach me something about your perspective on time? And he says this, teach me to number my days. Like my days are numbered. So would you teach me to number them or to count them or to make them count so that we may gain a heart of wisdom? Here's what's important for us to get in this, is that we've all numbered our days at some point or another. Maybe when you got married, you knew about how many days it was until you got married, right? I just asked the other day, one of my daughter's friends is getting married. I'm like, how many days left until you get married? And she told me the number. I just did a wedding last weekend, and a couple weeks before that, I said, how many days before till the wedding? They knew exactly the number. We've all numbered our days. Or maybe you were pregnant and the time that you became the mom for the first time. and you had a due date that the doctor gave you, and you were counting down the days until that day. Or maybe you knew how long until you graduated, or how long until this semester's over, or how long until the boss goes on vacation, right? We've all numbered our days at some point or another. But here's the interesting thing. We'll number our days to an event, but we won't number the days of our life, because we think that life just keeps going on. We kind of live a life jammed full of stuff, like it's going to go on forever and ever and ever and ever, and then time after time until that just one day this stops. But that's not the case. What Moses is saying is that is important. He's saying, God, you live from everlasting to everlasting. So would you give me a little bit of your perspective on time and help me understand that I might last 70 or 80 or in Moses' case 120 years, but would you help me to count my days, to make my days count, to number my days so that I might gain a heart of wisdom, because I can live like a person with a heart of wisdom. And if Moses can learn from God's perspective and we can learn from Moses' perspective, that you and I should remember some things. We should remember it this way. Remembering that our time is limited provides us the wisdom to know how to spend our limited time. Or to maybe put it a little bit simpler, and this is a statement that I've written on a card and I'm carrying in my wallet for the next couple weeks. My time is limited, so I need to limit how I spend my time. My time cannot afford for me to pack in all of the stuff. I can't afford to jam in without discretion or without thought. I can't afford to jam all those things. My time is limited, so I'm going to choose intentionally how I limit my time. So that's the question that you and I have to kind of process. Now, I want to give us a little bit of insight in, because we have a tendency to live in today, and we don't have the wisdom that we'll have. But you know what? If you ask somebody who's 60 and you're 40s, right? If you ask somebody who's 70 and you're in your 40s, if you ask somebody who's in their 80s and you're in your 40s, they'd have some wisdom to you, to give to you, that is from the future, right? There's this lady named Bronnie Ware. I'll put her name up here so you can kind of get it. But Bronnie Ware was a hospice nurse. But she specifically majored in kind of the last 14 days of care. Like, she would come into and care for not only the person who is caring, and some of you work in hospice care, and I want you to know what you do is an amazing ministry. What you do caring for people in their last days is a thankless and difficult but vital and beautiful goal and work. But Bronnie Ware spent her time really focusing on the last 14 days of people's lives. And in those 14 days, she would have conversations with them about the meaning of their life and the value of their life, and not only their medical care, but their emotional state, and yes, some of their spiritual state. And in the process of those things, she learned some things. She's since summarized that into a lot of different writings. It might even be a book. And she has kind of outlined the top 2 regrets that people had, and that she learned from people on the last days of their life. And I'm going to give them to you backwards. You probably would expect that this one would be the number 1 regret, but it's actually the number 2 regret. And people's number 2 regret is that I wish I hadn't worked so hard. What's interesting is this quote. Look at what it says. It says, "This came from every male patient that I nursed. They missed their children's youth and their partner's companionship." It said women also spoke of this, but as most were from an older generation, many of the female patients had not been breadwinners. Look at what it says. "All of the men that I nursed deeply regretted spending so much of time, so much of their lives on the treadmill of a work existence." Man, think about it. Think about the perspective that you're getting. These people who are in their 70s, 80s, maybe even early 90s, maybe even like that lady who jumped out of a plane this week to celebrate her 100th birthday. Maybe like my grandma who is 102 years old, or maybe like Moses, 120. We'd hear about it on the news, sure. But all of these people, what we're looking at is a time machine that gives us the vantage point, the wisdom of their years communicated to our years. And what they're saying is they regretted spending so much time on the treadmill of the work existence. That's their number 2 regret. Begs the question, right? What could possibly be their first regret? If their second regret, the second most common regret, or the second biggest regret was that they wish they wouldn't have worked so hard, what could possibly be the number one regret? Look at this. I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself and not the life that other people expected of me. That fear of measuring up, that fear of not mattering, the fear of not being significant. I wish I had the courage to live a life that was true to who I am, true to myself, instead of having to live a life out of fear of someone else. This is what she wrote about it. She said, this is the most common regret of all. When people realize that their life is almost over and they had a chance to look back clearly on it, it's easy to see how many dreams have gone unfulfilled. Most people had not honored even half of their dreams and had to look back on it, knowing that it was due to the choices they'd made or not made. Now, brace yourself for this. This is important, because these next words are the words from a time machine, that if your future self would come back today and tell you, listen, in the last 14 days of your life, you're going to have this regret. Look at what she says. Health brings a freedom that very few realize until they no longer have it. Your time is limited, so choose to limit what you do with your time, because health brings a freedom that you don't even realize until you don't have the freedom anymore, and then all of a sudden, time after time after time, until there's no more time. I know what you're saying, though. I know there's a part of every one of us that goes, yeah, but I've got to do this, right? I've got to make this happen. I got to get this over the tracks. I got to make that work. And if I don't do as much as I possibly can, I will never make it. Well, what's it? Don't you owe it to yourself to answer that question? What is it? If you're going to spend your entire life jamming stuff into this thing that you call a life, jamming more stuff in so that you can make it, don't you owe it to yourself to know what it is? I think you do. I think that if you're in high school or college or young adulthood and you're going, man, I got to make it one day, well, what is it? And if you don't have a good answer for what it is, then why are you letting yourself jam your life full of things that don't matter to help you make it to an it that you don't know what it is? I know the tension, right? Not only am I make it, I'm going to fall behind. And if I don't do as much as I possibly can, I'm going to fall behind. Well, let me ask you this. Fall behind who? Fall behind what? Right? If we don't keep our kids in this, they're going to fall behind who? The other kids? They're going to fall behind the idea? You owe it to yourself. You owe it to your children to ask this question. Who is it that you're trying not to fall behind? Who is it, or what is it? What is the ideal that you're trying to accomplish? That if you don't accomplish, you will fall behind it, because you owe it to yourself. You're jamming your life full to a point where you can't even enjoy all the things in your life, trying to keep from falling behind an idea that you don't even know what it is. I think you owe it to yourself to ask yourself, what is it that I'm going to try to make? Who is it that I'm trying not to fall behind? And then there's this other one that drives a lot of us. It's this one: if I don't do everything I can, I'll be poor. Here's my guess, is that you've never really stopped to evaluate what poor is. You've never really stopped to think, what do I have to make myself have enough? What is it that I have to have so that I can finally say, yes, that's what I need to make it? My guess is that you've never really thought what really is poor. But yet we're cramming our time, cramming our calendar, our schedule, our stuff. We're cramming it full of stuff, trying to make sure that we make enough money, that we have enough stuff, that we do all the right things so that we can not be poor. A poverty that we've never really even considered what it is. My guess is you've probably evaluated it, and you probably figured it out in your head based on something in your experience. Your it, or your falling behind, or your definition of poverty probably came from your parents. Either you don't want to, they didn't hardly make anything. They didn't have a lot of money, and so you're like, I'm just trying not to be poor like them. Or you're like, man, my it came from my parents. They had this stuff and I don't want to be like them. Or you're like, their lives were so just mediocre, right? That I don't want to be like them. Have you noticed there's no way to win as a parent? That you wind up, no matter what you do, trying to outdo or do differently than your parents did it. We want to be like them, but we don't want to be like them, right? There's no way to win. But it does come from somewhere in your life. You owe it to yourself to know what your it is. You know it. You owe it to yourself to know what you're trying not to follow behind. You owe it to yourself to know exactly what it is that you would define as poor. And then there's this other one that's probably a big piece of all of our lives. If I don't do as much as I possibly can, I won't be accepted. Accepted by whom? I mean, who is it that you're looking to achieve acceptance by? Some other person? You owe it to yourself to know that. Can I speak to you if you're in high school or college for just a second? High school, college, young adulthood, maybe you're single, maybe you're getting married, maybe you just got married, whatever. In that first part of your life, your parents have told you this before, but you don't listen to your parents, so listen to me. Your parents have told you the people that you know now, in 5 years, they won't even be on your radar. 5 or 10 years, you won't know their name. Oh, you're like, oh yeah, I remember I used to hang out with that person. That person that you're cramming all of your stuff into your life, you're doing all those things that you're trying to impress, that person you're trying to be accepted and cared for by, you won't know their name in 5 years. I'll promise you this, that they're going to be moved on, you're going to be moved on, and keeping up with them on social media doesn't count. You're trying to be accepted by a person who is no longer going to be a part of your life in just a few years. Why not choose to say, I know what my it is. I'm going to make it as a committed follower of Jesus. Why not saying, I don't want to fall behind anything except for God's plan and call for my life? Why not saying, I will be rich in the things that matter? Why not saying that I want to be accepted and loved only by God and everybody else can just take it or leave it? Maybe that's the question for you. What are those things in your life? Remember last week I gave you this card or told you about this idea. Then I want you to consider what needs to be added to your life. What needs to be taken away from your life? What needs to be increased in your life, greater than? What needs to be decreased in your life? Can you fill those in? I mean, as you look at your calendar, based on knowing what your it is, knowing who you're not trying to follow behind, knowing what poverty is, maybe beginning to say, what is it that needs to be added to your life? Because your time is limited. So you have to limit what you do with your time. What needs to be taken away from your life? For some of us, a name needs to go here. A series of initials. Somebody's a person in your life that goes, man, that person is just pushing me to do things that aren't really in keeping with who I am. I'm crowding my life full of something that needs to go away. What needs to be increased to make your life full? What needs to be decreased to make your life less full? It's a question that you and only you can answer. But God, teach us to number our days so that we might gain the heart of wisdom and recognize that life is better with breathing room.